A soft, golden light, like silk, bathed the town of Riverside on a late May afternoon. It spread gently across the whispering eucalyptus trees and the shimmering surface of the Colorado River as it surged below. A light spring breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the clear, ringing laughter of children playing in the distance along the riverbank. On Riverside Bridge, the tallest and largest in town, rising over 100 feet above the rushing waters, Grace Whitaker walked slowly, holding tightly to the leash of a playful German shepherd puppy trotting at her side. Atlas was only 3 months old, but already full of promise. His coat was jet black, streaked with warm brown like a fire taking root. His long, clumsy legs and oversized ears, still not yet fully upright, gave him a gait that was both goofy and full of life. There was something in his eyes, in the way he tilted his head at the sound of wind slipping through the railings, stretched toward a spinning leaf drifting down. That made Grace smile. She hadn't thought she could feel peace again, not after everything she'd been through. Grace had once served in a special military medical unit, where life or death decisions were measured not in days or hours, but in minutes. She returned from her final deployment carrying wounds that didn't show. For months, she lived in silence, until the day she found Atlas in a small rescue shelter on the outskirts of town. He was the last of the litter. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just looked up at her with a quiet, aching gaze. A connection that didn't need words. This afternoon was the first time Grace had taken Atlas beyond the small training yard behind her home to explore the outside world. She chose Riverside Bridge, a place she once stood for hours, watching the sunset when her mind was too heavy to move forward. For her, it was a milestone. For Atlas, it was simply a brand new world full of scents and motion waiting to be discovered. "Slow down, rookie," Grace said softly as the puppy tugged at the leash, straining toward the lingering scent of a jogger who had just passed by. Atlas turned back, tail wagging hard in agreement. He didn't quite understand the command, but that voice, warm, steady, was something he had learned to trust. The bridge was fairly busy. An elderly couple strolled nearby, a group of young people posed for photos, and bicycles zipped past on the adjacent lane. Grace stopped midway across, where she could look down at the white-tipped waves slamming the banks. The wind picked up here. She bent down and gently patted Atlas's head. He sat obediently, tail sweeping slow arcs across the concrete. If the day had ended at that moment, everything might have been different. But fate never chooses silence. A sudden screech of brakes. One of the cyclists swerved sharply to avoid a tourist stepping backward for a photo. The grating squeal of rubber on concrete startled Atlas. His small body jolted backward in reflex. In a moment too fast to stop, Grace felt the leash slip from her fingers. The collar slid off Atlas's head just as he stepped back again, right at the section of railing that had been damaged during last week's storm. Grace cried out, her voice cracking in the wind, "Atlas, stop!" But panic had already drowned out all the training. Atlas turned, eyes wide, claws scraping for grip on the concrete. One hind leg slipped forward, and in a tilting second, those amber eyes flared with heartbreaking confusion. Grace lunged. Her outstretched hand barely brushed the soft fur on his shoulder. Too late. And then the little dog disappeared through the broken railing into the abyss below, swallowed by howling wind. Beneath, the Colorado River curled between jagged rocks and whirlpools, devouring sound and hope in one rush. Grace froze. There was no bark, no thud, no echo, only the churning water, frothing white, then settling for a few seconds into silence. No one on the bridge that day could have guessed that what seemed like the end of one small life was the beginning of something beyond explanation, and that, where others might give up a little puppy, would make the world believe again in the impossible. For a few long seconds after the fall, the entire bridge stood frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. The wind still blew through the steel beams. The river still surged below. But time itself seemed to halt, suspending the agony of the moment. Grace stood there, arms still extended into the empty air, reaching for what had slipped away. She stared down at the water. Only frothing white bubbles remained, swirling like they were erasing hope before it had a chance to take root. A gasp came from nearby. A woman covered her mouth. A child clutched his father's shirt, voice trembling. Did the puppy fall? Grace didn't answer. She had seen many passings, losses etched into her memory by the smoke, the explosions, and the fading eyes of fellow soldiers. But this fall, this wasn't the same. It wasn't just an accident. It was a moment when trust, fragile and tender like the downy fur behind Atlas's ears, was torn away and cast into the void. While nearly every gaze on the bridge was fixed on the river in stunned despair, someone downstream had already taken action. Michael Chen, 28 years old, a seasoned kayaker and river guide on the Colorado, was prepping for an afternoon trip when he caught sight of the unthinkable. Without hesitation, he grabbed his paddle and shoved his kayak into the roaring current. Michael had rescued people from these waters before. He knew the dangers: hidden rocks sharp enough to tear through flesh, undercurrents strong enough to drag down even the strongest swimmer. But he also knew there was still a chance. As thin as a strand of hair, but sometimes it's the fragile thread that pulls forth the fiercest instincts. Grace, once her body remembered how to move, didn't need logic to guide her feet. She tore off the bridge, pushing through the stunned crowd, sprinting down the jagged riverbank. Rocks tore at the soles of her shoes. Her breath came shallow and burning. She didn't care. In her mind, there was only one image: Atlas's amber eyes, wild with confusion, his soaked black and gold fur, and that little tail that had never once stopped wagging when she called his name. On the water, Michael paddled like the river was on fire. Spring runoff had doubled the speed of the current. His eyes scanned the surface. No splashing, no sound. And then, 30 meters downstream from where Atlas had fallen, a flicker of movement. A tiny head, fur soaked and matted, broke the surface, gasping for breath. Michael shouted without sound, dug in harder with his paddle. Atlas was alive, but he was struggling. His 4 little legs weren't enough to fight the current. His head bobbed above the surface, eyes wide, not with fear, but as if searching, trying to find the one voice he trusted. Grace reached the rocky bank, eyes locked on the fragile movement in the water. "Come on, baby, come on, Atlas," she whispered. A prayer, a command from the heart, not just to him, but to the universe itself, begging it not to take away a life that hadn't yet had the chance to give all the wonder it held. Ahead, Michael was closing in. Atlas bobbed, dipped, and rose again. Just seconds more. And if the river dragged him under again, there would be no second chance. But he didn't give in. In that tiny body, a quiet will kept him afloat. A drive to continue, not knowing why he'd fallen, not knowing where he was going. He swam. A 3-month-old puppy in the largest river of the American West, swam with every last heartbeat he had. The whole town of Riverside held its breath, and this was only the beginning. Still alive, those 2 words echoed silently in Michael's mind when he caught a glimpse of the drenched ears of the tiny pup breaking the water's surface. But just a few breaths later, that small head sank again, only to bob back up like a young leaf torn by the current. That life was so fragile it seemed the river could erase it with a single shrug. And yet, that very fragility made each moment Atlas surfaced feel like a miracle, not driven solely by instinct, but by something deeper, a refusal to accept the ending laid out for him. Michael dug hard with his paddle, water slicing in long arcs behind the bow. All other sounds faded. No wind, no shouts from the shore, only the pounding of his heart and his unbroken gaze on the tiny figure ahead. He knew this part of the river well, and he knew, just a few meters ahead, A dead tree was lodged between two rocks, forming a natural trap. It was called a strainer, a killer net that could pull even grown adults beneath the surface and never let them go. Atlas was drifting straight toward it. On shore, Grace had reached the bend in the river where Atlas was fighting to stay afloat. She stood, gasping, hands gripping the cold stone railing, eyes locked on every movement he made. Her heart was a tangle, like a rope pulled too tight between logic and hope. Grace had seen many lives swept away by time and circumstance, but never had she felt so helpless. Atlas wasn't just a puppy. He was her quiet reminder that the world still held beauty worth believing in. The current was now drawing Atlas directly toward the dead tree, its dozens of dry, gnarled limbs spread out like a demon's arms waiting to drag him in. Michael screamed into the wind, paddling with all his might. But the distance was still too great. He knew, if Atlas hit those roots, there would be no coming back. And then, something unbelievable happened. A small piece of driftwood, thin, brittle, seemingly harmless, was floating freely with the current. Suddenly it shifted. It didn't drift straight as expected, but veered slightly, spun gently, and slid right into the narrow space between Atlas and the deadly tree. The motion was too precise to be called coincidence, as if some unseen force had chosen that exact moment to nudge reality. Atlas bumped into the driftwood, just enough to slow his trajectory toward the strainer. He grabbed it with his front paws, part instinct, part understanding, as if he sensed he had just been pulled back from the edge. Michael seized the moment, closing the distance in a few powerful strokes. He leaned forward, extended his paddle, and shouted, "Grab it, buddy, grab it!" Atlas, soaked and trembling, turned his head. His eyes, though tired, though dazed, were not panicked. In that look there was more than survival. There was recognition. He knew who was coming. He knew this person meant hope, meant safety. One more wave passed. Then, slowly but surely, Atlas lifted a paw onto the paddle. Michael leaned in, keeping perfect balance, and scooped the small, water-heavy, freezing body into his arms. The pup didn't struggle, didn't cry out like animals often do when pulled from danger. Atlas simply lay there, eyes wide, soaked through, pressing himself tightly against the man who had saved him. It wasn't surrender from exhaustion. It was trust, complete and unquestioning. Just then, the river rebelled one last time, surging up in a crashing wave. Michael turned, cradling Atlas, shielding him with his own body. The jolt rocked the kayak hard, but somehow it didn't flip. Michael held steady. And Atlas, miraculously calm, clung to him, as if knowing that if he didn't stay still, it would all be over. Grace saw everything from the bank. She couldn't breathe. Tears had started falling without her noticing, sliding down her cheeks and landing on the cold, rough stones below. Atlas was still alive. But more importantly, he still had hope. And somehow, in a way no logic could explain, the river hadn't taken him that day. As the last whirlpool faded behind them, the kayak drifted gently along the calmer edge of the river, and Michael Chen still couldn't quite believe what lay in his arms. Atlas, the 3-month-old pup who had fallen from Riverside Bridge, was curled motionless against his chest. His tiny body was stiff from cold and exhaustion, but he was breathing. Faint, shallow breaths, like mist dissolving in the golden light, but enough to keep a fragile hope alive in the heart of the current. Michael had been a professional kayaker and had faced wild rapids and razor-sharp turns, but never had he trembled like this, not from fear, but because he felt something different in the small creature he held. This wasn't just an animal rescued from death. This was a life that reached deep into something hidden within the human heart. Atlas didn't cry, didn't flail. He made no sound, no panicked reaction like most animals have after a brush with death. Instead, he trembled softly, pressing his drenched body into Michael's chest like a newborn seeking its mother's warmth. His amber eyes were half shut, But in the moment he'd looked up, Michael had seen something he'd never forget. Something close to understanding. Michael gripped the paddle, steering towards the shore, where Grace had already waded knee-deep into the muddy bank, pants soaked, hair wild in the wind, eyes locked on the drifting kayak. Never in her life had Grace felt so fragile. The battles she'd survived, the gunfire she'd run through, had never shaken her like this. But seeing that small figure lying limp in a stranger's arms unraveled every thread of control. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply stepped forward, slowly, her breath burning in her chest as if it were fire. When the kayak reached the edge, Michael looked up. No words were exchanged. Gently, without ceremony, he passed Atlas into Grace's waiting arms. It felt like a ritual, wordless, sacred, between one soul and another. The little dog stirred as she held him. Not in protest, just the faintest motion, as if to say, "You're here now?" Grace pulled him close, cradled him against her chest, and pressed her face to his sodden fur. She didn't care about the cold sinking into her skin. All she could feel was his fragile breath and the faint warmth fighting to stay inside his tiny frame. "Atlas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You did it." No one in the gathered crowd dared to interrupt. Some fell silent. A child clung to his mother and whispered, "Is the puppy alive?" The mother nodded, wiping her eyes. Grace knelt on the grass, laying Atlas on her thick coat, spread out like a cushion. She used the same hands that once set broken bones on the battlefield to examine each of his legs. No pain response, no strange angles. Nothing short of a miracle. A fall from over 30 meters into a raging river should have been fatal for any living thing. But Atlas was still here. Not whole, not unscathed, but alive. And something in him had changed. Michael had now climbed ashore and collapsed beside them, panting. "I don't know what happened at that log," he muttered. "He should have been pulled into the strainer, but that piece of wood cut across at just the right time. Like something pushed it. He shouldn't have survived, but he did." Grace looked up at Michael, eyes filled with more than gratitude. In her gaze was a quiet, unspoken question. What saved Atlas? A miracle? Instinct? Or something deeper, moving beyond human comprehension? She stroked the soft fur behind his ear, the spot that always made him tilt his head and wag his tail. This time he didn't tilt his head, but his tail, wet and heavy, gave a single, tiny wag. A ripple, like a wave brushing the shore of her heart. The wail of an ambulance siren rose in the distance. Paramedics rushed in with thermal blankets and emergency kits. But Grace gently raised her hand. She would take care of this. She wasn't just a dog owner. She had been a medic. And right now, Atlas wasn't just a puppy. He was the spark that reminded her emotions she thought she had buried could still rise, still burn. She wrapped him in the blankets, held him close, and whispered in his ear, "It's over now. You're safe. I've got you." And with his eyes gently closed, breath still quick but no longer panicked, Atlas, the 3-month-old pup, surrendered to the first sleep he'd known since falling from the bridge, curled in the arms of a woman who once believed she might never love anything again. As Atlas drifted into sleep in Grace's arms, warm, trembling, but steady, not a single person on that riverbank dared disturb him. The silence wasn't just out of respect for a life just saved, but because deep down, everyone sensed they had just witnessed something beyond chance. A fragile creature had fallen nearly 30 meters into a raging river filled with jagged rocks. Not crushed, not battered, not pulled under. And now he was sleeping like a child, safe after the storm. The rescue team had arrived, but Grace refused to let Atlas be taken by ambulance. She wanted to bring him somewhere familiar, a quiet corner behind the local veterinary clinic, where she used to volunteer after leaving the military. There was soft golden light, warm blankets, and the gentle scent of antiseptic he'd known during his first vaccination. More importantly, there was someone she trusted completely. Doctor. James Wilson, a man not only skilled in his field, but patient enough to listen when something unexplainable happened. Wilson had arrived almost immediately upon hearing that Atlas had survived. He was the calm, seasoned type, rarely surprised by unexpected outcomes. But when Grace laid Atlas on the exam table, wrapped gently in a thermal blanket, and recounted everything that had happened, even his typically unreadable expression began to shift, his brows furrowing deeper with each detail. "Fell from that height and didn't break a single bone?" he repeated, more to confirm what he couldn't believe. The exam light reflected off the damp, mud-speckled fur, but under his skilled hands, every joint was carefully checked. No swelling, no deformities, no whimper of pain. When he placed his stethoscope against Atlas's chest, the heartbeat was fast but steady. Lungs are slightly moist, but no wheezing to suggest fluid. Abdomen soft, reflexes normal. Just a few minor scratches on his legs and a small bruise near the left hip. Nothing serious. Wilson exhaled slowly and set the stethoscope down. "Grace, I don't know how to explain this." She sat nearby, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of Atlas's back. "Neither do I," she said softly. "I've seen men twice his size crushed by falls from half that height. I know the numbers. I know the force. I know what's supposed to be impossible." Wilson nodded, his expression softening as he sat beside her, wiping the last bits of mud from Atlas's coat. "Then maybe we just witnessed something outside of statistics." "Or beyond what science can measure," Grace added, never looking away from Atlas. He was still sleeping. Not restless, not anxious, just small flickers under his eyelids, like he was dreaming of something far away. His legs curled in, slowly stretching and pulling back. A normal reflex, but something about the rhythm suggested a door had opened somewhere, inviting in a kind of awareness without a name. "This little guy?" Wilson said quietly, his hand resting on the blanket wrapped around Atlas. "It's not just luck. Maybe he brought something else back with him." The room fell silent. The white light shone through the frosted glass, catching the curve of the pup's small back as it rose and fell. Each breath was a miracle. And the strangest part wasn't that Atlas was alive, but that in his aliveness, there wasn't a trace of fear. None. He didn't flinch, didn't whimper when touched, didn't glance around for escape. Instead, when Wilson pressed lightly on his chest, Atlas stretched his neck. Not to pull away, but as if to respond. Grace watched it all in silence. Having once learned to read the flick of an eyelid on the battlefield, she could tell that Atlas wasn't just healing physically. Something else, some deeper layer of perception, was beginning to rise in him. Not obvious, but enough for her to feel a silent dialogue between him and everything around him. Wilson finished the exam, wrapped Atlas in a dry towel, and looked at her. His voice softened. "Medically speaking, there's nothing to treat. No broken bones, no internal trauma, no hypothermic shock. But one thing I know for sure, this boy isn't like any four-legged patient I've ever had." Grace nodded gently, her hand still resting on Atlas's back, feeling the trembling slowly to stillness. Inside her, something stirred. Not joy, not relief, but a deeper connection. Between human and animal, between intuition and knowledge, between what is seen and what is only felt. And this was only the beginning. Grace didn't know exactly when she stopped counting the time since the moment Atlas fell from the bridge. Maybe it was when she first held him in her arms, soaking wet but still breathing, or when Dr. Wilson pressed the stethoscope to his chest and shook his head in disbelief. Or maybe it was that exact moment, when she sat by the old cot in the back room of the clinic, watching the little pup curled in his wool blanket, breathing steadily as if the fall had never happened, and realized she had entered a realm beyond names. Atlas hadn't just survived. He was recovering faster than anyone could have imagined. After just one night under a heating lamp, a few drops of electrolyte solution, and some mashed food, he was able to stand on all fours, still limping slightly on his back right leg. But what puzzled Grace wasn't the speed of his recovery. It was the way Atlas moved. Slow, deliberate, as if each step was being consciously measured. He was no longer the clumsy pup with legs too long for his body, stumbling through each step like in his early days. He walked lightly, precisely, and his eyes, those eyes, had changed. They no longer held naive curiosity. Now they held the look of something that had seen what others never could. 3 days later, Atlas was nearly physically back to normal. He ate well, slept soundly, and even wanted to walk around the backyard as if he had never collapsed from exhaustion. But then the strange behaviors began. At first subtle, vague, then so clear Grace couldn't ignore them. On the 4th morning, as Grace was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, she paused mid-motion, forgetting where she'd placed her phone. Before she could turn to look, Atlas, who had been lying in the living room, suddenly trotted over, carrying the phone gently in his mouth, and placed it neatly at her feet. Grace froze. She hadn't said a word, hadn't given any signal, and the phone was silent. No call, no vibration. "When did you find it?" she whispered. Atlas didn't answer, of course, but he looked up at her. Calm, steady, as if to say it was obvious. That afternoon, while Grace was reading documents in her office, Atlas, who appeared to be asleep in the corner, suddenly stood up, walked to the front door, and sat down. 3 seconds later, there was a knock. It was Wilson, carrying his portable test kit. When Grace opened the door, the doctor blinked. "He knew I was here before I knocked?" Grace nodded, still unsure how to explain. But the next day, it happened again, with a deliveryman. And again, when a neighborhood child came by with a package. Atlas always went to the door before any sound arrived. Then one evening, as Grace was getting ready to go out, she reached for her coat and found the hook empty. Before she could turn toward the bedroom, Atlas appeared in the hallway, her gray coat rolled neatly in his mouth, tail wagging slightly. He laid it down in front of her and looked up, not with pride, but with a calm certainty that said, "I knew you'd need this." Everything became more obvious one afternoon when clouds rolled in suddenly, despite a weather forecast predicting clear skies. Before the wind shifted, before the sky turned gray, Atlas stood up from his nap, walked to the window and sat staring outside. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just sat there, strangely alert. Grace paid it no mind, until 10 minutes later, the rain came pouring down in sheets. From then on, she started keeping notes, recording each time Atlas responded to something before it happened. Every time the phone was about to ring. Every time someone arrived unannounced. Every time the water jug in the kitchen neared empty. Atlas was always the first to act, not out of need, but as if to remind her. When she told Wilson, he stayed quiet for a long while. Then he closed his notebook and said, "Grace, maybe what he brought back from the river wasn't just survival. Maybe he brought something else." "You mean an ability?" she asked, half believing. "Not sure," Wilson replied. "But if this is all coincidence, then we're witnessing too many coincidences in a row, and the world rarely works that way." Grace didn't respond. She just looked at Atlas, who was then resting his head on her leg, ears perked even as his eyes remained closed. He was no longer the rescue shelter pup she brought home. No longer the fragile creature who stumbled after her coat hem. Something had changed in him, a quiet awareness that needed no words. And Grace knew the real strange part was only just beginning. A few days after the unexpected rainstorm, while Grace was still sifting through her unresolved notes and unanswered questions, she decided to take Atlas back to where everything began. The riverside beneath the Riverside Bridge. It wasn't out of nostalgia, nor a test for him. It was simply a strange pull, as if she needed to confirm that what had happened wasn't some hallucination, that the river, the fall, the survival, and whatever was now growing inside Atlas were all real. That afternoon, the sky was clear and the breeze was gentle. A pale golden light lay across the wild grass by the river, and the water reflected like a mirror softly stirred by time. Atlas walked beside her without fear. without hesitation. His gait now was steady and fluid, nothing like the clumsy trot of a 3-month-old pup she once knew. But what Grace noticed wasn't his walk. It was something in his behavior that had changed. The silence, the focus, and most of all, his eyes. They no longer looked to her for cues. They seemed to be listening to another world, one humans couldn't touch. As they neared the bridge, Grace intended to follow the familiar path that led to the lower stone banks. But Atlas stopped. He stood motionless, head raised, ears pointed forward as if catching a sound beyond human hearing. Then, without warning, he turned and headed in another direction, toward a patch of overgrown weeds, unmarked by footprints. "Atlas?" Grace called, surprised. He didn't turn around, but neither did he rush. His tail swayed gently, like a signal. Then he stopped fully and looked back at her again, his gaze deliberate. Grace said nothing. She had witnessed him act on this eerie intuition too many times now. And this time, something inside her nodded. She followed him into the tall grass. They made their way along a narrow strip of land by the riverbank, where clusters of reeds grew thick among dry branches and tangled vines. With each step, the leaves rustled under her feet. Atlas moved silently, weaving through the brush with the grace of a creature who belonged here. Then he stopped. He lowered his head and let out a soft whimper, not in pain, but like a whisper meant for the one behind him. Grace moved closer and bent down. From beneath the tangle of reeds came a strange scent, earthy, slightly metallic, damp. She parted the grass. A white plastic bag lay half submerged in the muddy water, one end loosely tied, the other soaking in the shallow creek. Inside, 3 tiny creatures curled up, soaked and chilled to the point of bluish purple. Their eyes hadn't opened yet, and their newborn fur was matted and wet, barely able to retain heat. Grace gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered, her chest tightening. She pulled open the bag, hands trembling as she lifted each kitten out. Their bodies were so light it felt like they had no bones, just trembling lumps of fragile life clinging to their final breaths. If she'd been just hours later, the rising tide would have drowned this spot, and those 3 lives would have disappeared, unnoticed. Atlas sat beside her, watching, but didn't move forward. He whimpered again, his gaze filled not with expectation, but the quiet purpose of a guide who had finished his task. No need for praise, no request for reward, just, "I knew they needed to be found." Grace quickly took off her coat and wrapped the 3 kittens in its soft lining, pressing them close to her body. "They're still breathing, Atlas. Still breathing," she murmured, turning to look at him. Atlas didn't bark. He just nudged the hem of her coat gently, a touch so light it could have gone unnoticed but carried the deepest tenderness. Back at the clinic, Wilson was already waiting. There was little need for words. Together they placed the kittens in a small incubator, switched on the heater, and fed them drops of nutritional formula. No one asked Grace why she'd been in such a remote spot. And when she said, simply, "Atlas led me there," Wilson looked at the dog lying by the door, head resting on his front paws, eyes fixed on the incubator. He knew they were there, Wilson asked, as though needing confirmation for something he barely dared believe. Grace nodded. "I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. I had no idea there were living creatures out there. But Atlas, he knew." At that moment, both of them fell silent. Inside the incubator, the 3 tiny lives breathed shallowly, but steadily. Life hadn't let go of them, not thanks to chance, but because of a 3-month-old puppy who had survived an unexplainable fall and was now taking his first steps into a role no one could teach. A seeker of life, guided only by wordless instinct. Grace sat down beside Atlas, laying a hand on his back, feeling the warm rise and fall beneath fur that had thickened over the weeks. "You saw what I couldn't, didn't you?" she whispered. Atlas didn't move, but his eyes, those ever-steady eyes, remained fixed on the incubator, watching the fragile heartbeats return to strength. And within Grace, something unfamiliar began to take root. Not surprise, not doubt, but a quiet faith. This boy had come back from the river with a gift no one could teach, no one could explain, a sensitivity beyond hearing, beyond sight, and maybe beyond the limits of his kind. Sitting beside Atlas in the quiet hum of the incubator room, where the 3 kittens still clung to life under soft yellow light, Grace felt something inside her soften, as though the hardened layers forged by years of war were finally cracking, revealing a space within her she had never dared name. She didn't know why she sat so long, hand resting on Atlas's back, saying nothing, needing nothing. He stayed still, unmoving, his breath calm and steady, his eyes watching the kittens as if keeping guard over their dreams with his quiet alertness. It was in that stillness that the memory came, like waves breaking against a worn cliff. Not violent, but unstoppable. Afghanistan, 7 years ago. Sand, smoke, and wind cut through every layer of armor. Jagged mountain ridges stretched beneath a gray sky, no trees in sight, only the smell of gunpowder and the whir of helicopters slicing the air. Grace, then a field medic lieutenant, had just finished a critical triage shift at a forward base. Her closest friend, Staff Sergeant Daniel Rios, was the one she trusted above all, not just for his skill, but for the simple faith he carried, that something good still existed in this world, even in a place that had all but forgotten humanity. Always beside him was Shadow, a black Belgian Malinois trained for mine detection and search and rescue. Shadow was the soul of their unit, not for his bravery, but for his silence, for how he once stood guard over a fallen soldier's body through the night, refusing food, rest, or even to move until the retrieval team came. That day began as routine, a clearance mission along a path suspected of IEDs, but within 4 minutes, everything fell apart. An explosion shattered the desert's silence. Smoke choked the air. She was thrown from the armored vehicle, ears ringing, blood streaming from her forehead. Crawling through debris, she reached the blast site, only to find Daniel motionless, blood soaking his uniform, and Shadow collapsed beside him, body contorted, eyes still open, as if dying mid-duty. She did everything she could. CPR, fluids, radioed for evac, but it was all too late. That wound never made the reports. No medals were awarded. No one spoke of it as a sacred loss. But to Grace, Daniel and Shadow were part of a belief that had died with them, that she could save anyone with her skill. From that day on, she stopped believing in fast enough, in time, or miracles. She left the military the following year, walked away from duty, from her team. No funerals, no farewells. Just silence, lived out in a small town by a river she chose for one reason only. It was quiet. Now, watching Atlas resting with his head on his paws, eyes still on the incubator like a tiny sentry, all the things she had buried in silence cracked open. Not with noise, not with tears, just quiet shifts in her chest. Each breath a little deeper, each heartbeat no longer clenched so tight. Atlas wasn't Shadow. He wasn't Daniel. But something in him, in the way he patiently watched over fragile lives, in the way he found what others missed, in the wordless depth of his gaze, made her remember, not in pain, but as part of what kept her alive. Wilson entered with the kitten's temperature charts. Seeing her seated there, he didn't speak. He just rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "They're going to make it," he said, softly but firmly. Grace nodded, eyes never leaving Atlas. "I know, because he found them. He did more than that," Wilson replied, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room bathed in soft light and the shallow breaths of 3 lives saved. Grace leaned down and stroked the ridge of Atlas's back. "I once promised I'd never let another die on my watch," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to him, to herself, or to a soul she never stopped remembering. Atlas opened his eyes and wagged his tail once. Not in response, more like a signal. You were heard. And at that moment, a thin sheet of ice inside Grace, frozen since that afternoon in a distant desert, began to melt. Not with noise, but enough for her heart to beat again, the way it used to when she still believed in miracles. That afternoon, as the sun tilted toward the trees lining the riverbank and the 3 kittens rested safely in their incubator, Grace stood by the window of the clinic, her hand unconsciously running along Atlas's back as he sat beside her. He lifted his head, ears perked toward the road, several seconds before she even noticed, and then stood up, calmly walked toward the front door, and stopped at the glass panel as if waiting for something. She didn't have to ask. Lately, Atlas always knew. He knew when someone would knock, even when no one had said a word. A sand-colored Jeep pulled up by the curb. The door opened, and stepping out into the golden dusk came a tall figure, sun-darkened skin, heavy but steady steps. His hair was flecked with gray, sunglasses perched on his forehead, and the old uniform he wore was no longer in regulation. But Grace recognized him instantly, her heart slowing with a mixture of surprise and something harder to name. Marcus Hale, a former comrade, a man she had fought beside through some of the most brutal missions, and the one who trained dogs like Shadow, the K9 who had died with Daniel in a memory that never faded. "Been a while," he said, his voice gravelly and deep, like the desert had never quite left his throat. But his eyes, quiet, discerning, were still the same Marcus she remembered, a man who spoke little, but saw everything others missed. Grace nodded, not replying at first. Inside her, emotions were shifting. Surprise, caution, gratitude. Atlas was already sitting at the threshold. No barking, no growling. He simply watched, with a stillness rare in a puppy not yet 4 months old. When Marcus came closer, Atlas stood, walked slowly over, sniffed his hand gently, then wagged his tail, not with excitement, but with quiet approval. Marcus knelt and extended his hand. "You're the boy, aren't you?" he said softly, almost in a whisper. Atlas sat, tilted his head slightly, and stared at the newcomer as if weighing something. Grace had never seen him react this way to a stranger. Not wary, but not overly trusting either. It was a kind of connection that seemed to operate on a deeper plane. Pure instinct. "You know," Grace finally spoke after a pause. Marcus nodded. "I read the article. That photo of him, by the river, in your arms, was the first thing that stopped me." He looked up, his expression softening. But it was the look in his eyes that made me come back. Grace didn't ask more. They didn't need words. Between people who had once crossed the line between life and death together, some things only required a glance. "He's not like the dogs I used to train," Marcus said, his eyes still fixed on Atlas. "He carries something different. It's not just sharp senses. It's a kind of connection I've never seen before. Like he's listening to the world in a way humans never could." Grace slowly sat on the step beside him. "I can't explain it either. He found kittens in a plastic bag. Led me straight to them. No scent, no sound, no tracks." Marcus didn't look surprised, just thoughtful. Maybe he's becoming a kind of living map. A being who senses, not only what is, but what's coming. "That's why you came?" Grace asked quietly. He nodded. "I've seen too many K9s exploited, used for shows, tests, made into specimens for experiments to feed human curiosity or hunger for fame. If this story spreads, Atlas won't be spared. You'll need someone to protect him, not just from physical threats, but from the world's prying eyes." Grace fell silent. Part of her had already sensed it coming. The emails piling up, the sponsorship offers, invitations to speak at research centers. She had turned them all down, but she knew, sooner or later, she wouldn't be able to keep all the doors closed alone. "So you're here for him?" she asked. Marcus turned to her, his gaze steady. "No, I'm here for both of you." Atlas wagged his tail once, then gently rested his head on Marcus's knee, as if sealing the connection. And in that quiet moment, Grace felt something she hadn't since leaving the military: the return of a teammate. Marcus's arrival was like an anchor dropped into the growing undertow quietly forming around Grace's once peaceful life. And even as she and Atlas slowly adjusted to his presence, a comrade from the past with deep knowledge of dogs, loyalty, and clarity, the outside world was already growing impatient. The story of the miraculous puppy who survived a fall from Riverside Bridge and went on to rescue lives began to spread like wildfire. It started with a short article in the local lifestyle section. Then a regional news site picked it up, adding a photo of Atlas sitting beside the incubator of 3 fragile kittens. Soon after, a passerby's phone video, showing Atlas dashing into the underbrush with Grace close behind, hit hundreds of thousands of views within a day. And then, the storm came. Within a week, the clinic phone rang non-stop. Grace's email was flooded with interview requests, partnership offers, and even funding proposals from organizations whose names sent chills down her spine. Reporters waited at the gate each morning, cameras and microphones in hand, eager to catch any moment that might go viral. Do you believe this dog is a miracle? Was he specially trained beforehand? Do you have plans to share Atlas's abilities with the community? Grace deflected every question, gently but firmly. She didn't want Atlas turned into a phenomenon. He wasn't a display piece. He wasn't a project. He was a life, her companion. And more than that, a part of what was slowly healing her invisible wounds. But among the crowd of curiosity, one letter stood out. Delivered in a cream envelope with embossed lettering that read simply, Heliogen Research and Strategy Institute. No flash, no fanfare, but very much to the point. The letter was short and formal, an invitation to participate in a series of studies on animal extrasensory perception and nonverbal sensitivity following extreme trauma. They offered to fully fund Atlas's ongoing medical care, provide Grace with a research fellowship if she joined the program, and assure minimal intrusion into the personal life of the subject under observation. Marcus read the letter, his eyes narrowing. Sounds familiar. Heliogen is a front, civilian arm of a military research group based in Utah. They once proposed neural rewiring programs for retired K9s. Outwardly, behavioral biology. Internally, programming. Grace placed the letter on the table, her expression taut. What do they want from Atlas? What people always want from what they can't control. To possess it. Silence settled over the room. Atlas was lying in the corner, not sleeping, just watching them, ears tilted, eyes calm and bright. He seemed to sense the tension in the air, and somehow Grace had developed a habit of looking into those eyes to steady herself. I'll decline, she said firmly. I won't hand him over to anyone. Marcus nodded. Good, but they won't stop. With every door you close, 3 more will open. Softer. Smarter, playing on your kindness to get to him without force. And just as he said, the days that followed brought a wave of politely worded refusals. TV invitations, offers from international research groups requesting non-invasive observation, and even a message from a government representative expressing interest in the dog's unprecedented rescue capabilities. But Grace didn't waver. One late afternoon, after a fresh rain, she sat with Marcus and Atlas on the back porch of the clinic. The air smelled of damp grass, frogs chirped from puddles. Atlas lay between them, head resting on Grace's leg, eyes half closed. I couldn't protect Daniel, couldn't save Shadow, Grace said, her voice tight but steady. I swore that if there was ever another chance, even for the smallest life, I wouldn't let anyone take it for the wrong reasons. Marcus didn't speak. He poured more tea and handed her the cup. We'll keep that promise, he said softly. With every tool a survivor has, and under that damp roof, among a woman, a dog, and a silence both deep and warm, an unspoken pact was formed to protect what was growing inside those eyes, the ability to see what others could not. In the days after Grace firmly rejected the Heliogen invitation, the air around the clinic seemed to settle. Though a few reporters still lingered along the narrow road leading to the back lot, most had left, disappointed by the absence of any sensational revelation. In that fragile peace, Grace returned to her work, and Atlas, as always, remained by her side, silently watching every movement with his strange, deeply perceptive gaze. One early autumn morning, the wind carried the scent of earth mixed with a faint aroma of wild daisies. Mrs. Jefferson, a longtime client, entered the clinic carrying her elderly gray cat, Shadow, wrapped in a beige towel. She said Shadow had been eating less the past few days, but he was still walking around, still meowing for head scratches every morning. Probably just age catching up with him. Dr. Wilson was washing his hands in the minor surgery room when Atlas, napping under the front desk, suddenly sprang to his feet. He didn't bark, didn't charge. He simply walked directly toward Mrs. Jefferson, not hurried, but with purpose, and stopped in front of Shadow. He lowered his head slightly, ears flattened just a bit. Those amber eyes didn't look at the owner or at anything else. They focused entirely on the fragile body wrapped in the towel. Grace frowned. Atlas sat, unmoving, then let out a quiet whine, so soft it seemed trapped in his throat. Mrs. Jefferson flinched slightly. Grace stepped forward to gently coax him back, but then he lifted one paw and placed it gently on the exam table, right beside the cat. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Grace turned. "Wilson, could you take a look at Shadow now?" Dr. Wilson emerged, drying his hands and raising an eyebrow. "Mrs. Jefferson said it was minor, just some fussy eating." "Yes," Grace said, "but Atlas doesn't think so." The vet glanced at the dog sitting like a statue before the table, then chuckled lightly. "All right, young man, let's see how right you are." Shadow was laid gently on the exam table. Wilson began a full standard exam. Eyes, ears, nose, reflexes. Everything appeared fine. No fever, no swelling, no signs of pain on palpation. "Nothing unusual," he said. "If anything, just a little appetite loss from the seasonal change." Atlas remained seated, still, eyes fixed, not blinking, on the lower right abdomen of Shadow. Wilson set down his stethoscope, frowning. "Give me a few minutes." He retrieved the portable ultrasound, usually reserved for clear clinical suspicions. Grace stood by, her eyes flicking between the black and white screen and the shifting lines of Wilson's face. Seconds after scanning the lower right quadrant, his expression changed. "Hold on," he murmured. "Something's off here." He adjusted the probe, tapping the screen. A strange, bright spot appeared. Not large, but abnormal. Wilson quickly took a blood sample for rapid testing. Minutes later, the results showed an elevated white cell count. Early signs of inflammation. "Early-stage intestinal blockage," he said, his tone dropping. "It's not painful yet, but if we don't intervene in the next 24 hours, it'll get serious." Grace looked at Atlas. The pup was now watching Wilson as if awaiting confirmation. The vet turned, and for the first time in his decades of practice, he looked at a dog not with surprise, but with respect. "How did he know?" "I don't know," Grace said quietly. "He just does." Wilson stood in silence for a moment, then shook his head and chuckled, not with disbelief, but as if mocking his assumptions. "Unless this dog has a sixth sense, every tool I have showed nothing. No pain response, no bloating, no symptoms that would have made me suspect a thing." He leaned closer and looked at Atlas. "Where did you train, huh?" Atlas didn't wag his tail, didn't beam with pride. He simply turned and walked back to Grace, sitting quietly by her feet, as though the task was complete and needed no acknowledgement. That afternoon, Shadow was admitted for monitoring and fluid therapy. Atlas never entered the clinic room. He just lay outside the observation room door, head resting on his paws, eyes never leaving the small window. When Wilson later completed a minor procedure to relieve intestinal pressure, successfully, without full anesthesia, Shadow was out of danger. Mrs. Jefferson wept upon hearing the news. "If it weren't for that dog, I'd have thought Shadow was just tired." Wilson patted her shoulder, his eyes drifting toward the pup still lying peacefully on the porch. "That wasn't just noticing," he said. "That was a kind of listening I've never known." After that remarkable diagnosis with Shadow the cat, no one at the clinic doubted what Grace had long suspected. Atlas was operating on another level of perception, sensing signs before they could even manifest. Wilson began taking detailed notes with every case. Grace, though rarely speaking of it, placed real trust in his eyes, in the weighted silences he offered whenever he sensed something was wrong. And yet, despite the astonishment Atlas continued to evoke, his abilities had remained within the realm of medicine: diagnoses, intuitions, subtle premonitions, until one afternoon at Carson Lake, when the impossible happened again. Carson Lake lay to the west of town, a large body of water where families gathered on sunny weekends when the wind was still and the light golden. Grace, Marcus, and Atlas went for a picnic that Saturday, a rare period untouched by phone calls or media buzz. Atlas lay in the shade, eyes half closed as if asleep, but ears alert, every breath in quiet, focused equilibrium. The lakeside buzzed with activity. Children ran across the grass, adults laid out food, the air thick with the scent of barbecue smoke and the slap of water against rocks. Not far away, a young family had pitched their tent. A girl, about 16, had just entered the water with a few friends, her laughter echoing across the lake. Atlas was beside Grace when he suddenly stood up. No sound, no warning, no cry for help, just a flicker of something in his eyes, and then he was gone, streaking across the lawn like smoke through the sun. Grace sprang up. "Atlas!" Marcus rose instinctively, but the pup had already broken away, bounding with power and precision through the grass. People looked around, confused. Then Atlas plunged into the lake. The water, still moments before, erupted with spray as his body split through it. Grace ran after him, scanning the water, searching for what he had seen. Then a scream rang out. "She's not coming back up!" One of the girl's friends was shouting, pale with fear. "She was swimming, and then she just sank. She didn't surface." Panic spread. Some called for help, but Atlas was already halfway there. His swimming fluid, forceful, far beyond what anyone expected from a young dog. No one knew what he was doing, until, seconds later, he stopped, right over a spot, not far from shore but deep enough to vanish from view. He dove. People held their breath. Grace stood at the edge, hands clenched, silent. Then the water broke again. Atlas surfaced a soaked clump of fabric in his mouth. He pulled, then pulled again. A body began to emerge, a girl, limp, arms slack, head tilted back, white-faced, eyes shut. He kept her head above water, growling softly, using his front legs to hook into her shirt so she wouldn't slip. Rescue teams had just reached the shore. Grace didn't wait. She dove in, swimming toward them. Together, an ex-soldier and a miracle-born pup. They hauled the unconscious teen toward safety. Paramedics arrived just in time. CPR began immediately. 3 minutes later, her heart was beating. Her lungs took in the air again. "She had a seizure in the water," a rescuer confirmed. A minute later, and it would have been too late. A boy nearby whispered to his mother. How did the dog know where she sank? No one saw anything. No one had an answer. But the first to kneel down and gently touch Atlas's wet head was Grace. She said nothing, just laid a hand on his fur amid the noise and her own pounding heart. And Atlas, soaked, panting, remained calm, as if what he'd done was the most natural thing in the world. That evening, a video of the scene spread across social media. Footage of the young German shepherd launching into the lake before rescuers arrived, diving and pulling a life from the depths, captivated millions. Some called him the one who hears the silence, others, the angel in wet fur. But Grace, the only one who said nothing, simply sat beside him, drying his ears with a soft towel, whispering, "Thank you for not ignoring what no one else could see." And as the late evening light spilled through the window, turning droplets on his fur to silver. Atlas wagged his tail once, like a quiet reply. After that fateful afternoon at Carson Lake, when Atlas pulled a young girl back from the fragile boundary between life and death, the reputation of the young German shepherd was no longer confined to the small town. Yet Grace still tried to preserve the quiet rhythm of their lives, building soft boundaries between herself and the outside world. In her heart, each time Atlas saved a life, he carried with him a nameless burden, and she, by some unspoken agreement, would carry the rest, protecting him from exhaustion, from curious gazes, from the spiraling hunger for possession. One early autumn morning, the clinic welcomed a young visitor. Mia, 8 years old, came with her father, Tom Pearson, a tall man with weariness etched deep into his eyes. The little girl was led by the hand, her face pale as paper, her wide-open eyes empty. She said nothing and looked at no one. She simply clung tightly to a worn-out stuffed rabbit, as if it were the only thread tethering her to this world. "She's been traumatized since my wife died," Tom said softly, avoiding direct eye contact. "A car accident. She died instantly. Mia was in the back seat, unharmed physically, but she hasn't spoken a single word since." Grace understood instantly. No more details were needed. That kind of grief didn't require explanation. It hung heavy in every gesture, every breath the father took. They hadn't come for a medical condition. They came because they'd heard that in this town, there was a dog who had helped another child, a boy who nearly drowned in the lake, somehow find his way through fear. And the father, holding on to a faint hope, wished that perhaps the miracle might happen again. Atlas was lying by the window, eyes half closed in the morning light. But the moment Mia stepped in, he rose. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't rush over. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the space between two beings, one standing still, the other with head bowed, and both seemed to hear something that made no sound. Grace held her breath. Mia hadn't touched anyone since the shock, but that day, she didn't flinch when Atlas approached. He moved slowly, each step feather light, as if he knew any sudden movement might shatter the fragile shell protecting the child's soul. He sat down gently, maintaining just enough distance to not intrude, only close enough that a child's arm could reach if she wished. He didn't push. He didn't cross boundaries. He was simply there, quiet, understanding. After a long pause, Mia slowly sat down. No one told her to. No one guided her. She placed her stuffed rabbit on the ground and then looked at Atlas for a long time. He returned her gaze, calm and unblinking. Then, in her first gesture after months of silence, Mia extended her hand, touching Atlas's ear. Grace barely dared to blink. Atlas stayed still, tilting his head slightly, then gently nestled it into that tiny palm. Not too deep, not too fast, as if he knew. The little girl's world didn't need grand gestures, but rather the delicate touch of trust. When Tom stepped forward, eyes glistening, Mia looked up and whispered, the first words she had spoken in over 60 days of absolute silence. "He understands me." There were no excess words, no uncertain tone, just a truth spoken with pure belief. Grace turned away, hiding the tears streaming down her face. At that moment, something became clearer than ever. Atlas wasn't just a lucky dog who had survived. He was a bridge, a link between broken souls and lives being mended by love, by a presence so gentle it defied description. From that day on, Mia came to the clinic every week, not for treatment, but to sit beside Atlas. She began to speak more, short sentences, simple and slow. But sometimes words weren't even needed, because Atlas remained by her side, ears alert, eyes quiet, his tail swaying in a rhythm no one ever taught him. And every time she smiled, Grace felt her heart slowly knit itself back together, piece by piece, by something no one could ever fully explain. Since the day he met Mia, The autistic girl who uttered her first word thanks to a gentle touch from a little dog, Grace had stopped defining Atlas as a pet, or even a brilliant companion. He existed as something beyond language or concept, quiet, never demanding, never seeking attention. Yet each of his actions made people feel they were standing before a being who could listen to the deepest things in their hearts, the ones that hadn't yet formed into words. That morning, dawn rose in stillness. Riverside was veiled in the cool breath of late summer, early mist still clinging to the clinic's front steps. Atlas lay by the window, his head resting on his front paws, eyes tracking the slow fall of dew along the glass. Grace was in the kitchen washing her hands, preparing breakfast, when she sensed something was wrong. He hadn't eaten. Atlas had never skipped a meal, not even after the most exhausting rescue. But today, he simply looked at his food, then walked away, heading straight for the front door. His movements were quiet, but tense. Grace followed, thinking he wanted a morning walk, but then stopped. It wasn't like every other day. He wasn't waiting. Atlas turned to look at her, a firm, unwavering gaze. Then a deep breath escaped him, trembling and heavy, like he had just crossed a fragile line. His eyelids fluttered. His body shivered, moving for the first time in hours. He was still alive. "Do you want to go somewhere?" she whispered. There was no reply, but in the tilt of his head and the urgency of his breathing, Grace felt something pressing, like someone was crying for help, not with screams, but with a thread so thin only he could hear it. Marcus had just pulled into the yard and caught sight of the scene. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at Atlas, then at Grace. "We're bringing the medical kit." On the road, Atlas didn't whimper or act agitated. He sat upright in the back seat, eyes wide open, ears perked, occasionally glancing west, toward a remote ridge rarely visited except by seasoned hikers or those who wandered off the map. Grace herself had only been there a few times. No phone signals, no marked trails, no missing person reports, no alerts from town. But Atlas knew. The car jolted over rugged roads, gravel crunching under the wheels as it protested. As they neared the junction of 3 obscure trails, Atlas suddenly stood up. He whined, not in demand, but as a signal, a short burst, sharp and insistent, like pointing the way. Grace hit the brakes and opened the door, grabbing only a water pack, the first aid kit, and Marcus before Atlas took off up the leaf-laden slope. No one led the way. No footprints. Only a small dog seemed to hear a call from places human eyes could not see. They crossed 3 hillsides, waded through a shallow creek, and curved around a massive boulder that blocked the view. Then Atlas stopped. He didn't bark, just let out a single, choked whine. Collapsed beneath an old pine tree was a man in his 50s, face pale, lips dry, eyes glazed as if his consciousness had already slipped away. He wore hiking pants and a thick windbreaker soaked with cold sweat. One hand loosely gripped an empty water pouch. The other clutched an unopened glucose candy. Grace knelt for a quick check. Weak pulse, crashing blood pressure, and clear signs of severe hypoglycemia. A few more hours, and it might have been too late. Marcus pulled a glucose gel from the kit and smeared it along the man's lips. They waited in silence as sunlight filtered through the trees. Then came a deep breath. The man blinked, trembled, but he was alive. "No one knew he was here," Marcus murmured. Grace sat beside Atlas, who now lay beside the man, his head resting on the man's thigh like a warm blanket. "No one," she whispered. "Except you." She clutched the leash in her hand tightly, as if holding on to something that had just slipped beyond human comprehension. Rescuers arrived half an hour later. The man turned out to be an engineer from another state, visiting the town for a weekend getaway. He decided to explore the ridge alone. Landing left no message. His phone had died. No GPS. No trace that could have helped anyone find him. Except for a dog who skipped breakfast, jumped into a car, and led his owner to the exact place, at the exact time. That evening, Grace sat alone on the back porch, Atlas curled up beside her, eyes still watching the distant hills. "What did you hear?" she asked, stroking the dust-covered line of his back. "How did you know?" Atlas didn't answer. He just looked up at her, then placed his head in her hand, as if to share something. No words, no explanation is needed. Because there are some things, when we truly listen with the heart, we can hear without ever using our ears. After that strange rescue on the deserted hillside, Grace thought she had grown used to all of Atlas's inexplicable behaviors. He was no longer just a dog learning about the world through scent and sound, but a being attuned to something deeper, a kind of intuition far beyond human perception. Yet only a few days later, he would again leave everyone in stunned silence. Not because of what he did, but because of what he sensed before it ever happened. That day was a special training session. Marcus had organized it in the northern pine woods outside town, a place that used to be the field base for the K-9 unit during his military years. Though officially retired, Marcus continued holding regular training sessions for the dogs currently housed at the rescue center. Atlas wasn't on the team, but ever since Marcus returned, he attended every session like a special student. No badge, no reflective vest, simply present and observing. Sometimes walking quietly beside a new dog, as if calming it without a single command. That morning, the wind was stronger than usual. The scent of pine resin was so thick in the air that it stung the nose. A few gray clouds lingered low on the horizon, but no one worried. The weather here was known to shift suddenly. Atlas lay on a small rise overlooking the training camp, where Marcus and two other trainers were instructing a group of young rescue dogs on basic maneuvers. Everything was proceeding as normal until Atlas suddenly stood up. Grace, who was chatting with a forest ranger, stopped mid-sentence as she heard Atlas whimper. A rare sound, brief but filled with warning. He wasn't looking at anyone. He lifted his head and turned into the wind, ears sharply perked, his posture like a living map recalibrating to shifts in the air's motion. Seconds later, he whipped his head around and bolted down towards the camp. No one understood. But when Atlas ran straight to Marcus and jumped up, pressing his front paws to the man's chest like a desperate signal, everything seemed to freeze in place. "Something's wrong," Marcus murmured. At that moment, a gust tore through the pine canopy, and with it came a burnt smell. Not from the campfire, not from charcoal, but the acrid stench of wildfire. A ranger shouted in panic, "Fire!" Smoke from the eastern slope. All eyes turned. A thin plume of smoke was rising from the dense forest, a place no one had entered since morning. A wildfire, sudden, of unknown origin, but already spreading. The wind made everything worse. "There's no time to evacuate through the main trail," Marcus barked. "Wind's pushing the fire toward the main road." As confusion surged through the camp, only Atlas broke from the crowd, slipping down a different path, not running in fear, but moving with purpose. He wasn't fleeing, he was leading. Then, as if responding to an invisible command, the other dogs began to follow. None panicked. They simply fell in line, one by one, drawn by the steady, silent rhythm of an instinct that pulsed within the frame of a small pup. Marcus and Grace didn't hesitate. They called the entire team, 13 people, 6 trained dogs. Within a minute, the whole group followed Atlas down a narrow path, not even marked on the maps. Atlas led the way, never looking back. Small in stature, but guiding with a presence that instilled unquestioning trust. The path was rugged, littered with decaying leaves and thick vines. But no one stopped. Behind them, the crackling sound of sap igniting began to echo, and the smoke was getting closer. It took nearly 25 minutes of non-stop running before they emerged from danger. The trail ended at a shallow creek bed, damp and low. There, firefighters were already arriving from the town's direction, guided by the last radio signal Marcus had managed to transmit. "This path isn't on the training maps," a firefighter said between gasps for breath. Grace turned to Atlas, standing at the creek's edge, panting heavily, his fur streaked with ash and dirt. He simply lifted his head, glancing at each person, then sat down, as if taking silent inventory of the lives that had just been saved. He chose the escape route before the fire even showed itself, Marcus said quietly. And for the first time, a seasoned rescue team, trained to direct dogs with commands and protocols, bowed in quiet respect to a 3-month-old puppy, whose gift was not cleverness, but an intuition deep as the roots of the forest itself. That night, after the fire was extinguished and the training grounds reduced to a field of ash, the head forest ranger called Grace. "Maybe we should invite Atlas to teach our team how to read invisible maps." Grace only smiled, glancing at Atlas asleep on the wooden floor, his tail gently wagging in a dream. The morning after the wildfire, smoke still clung to the scorched hills, and the acrid scent of ash mixed with pine sap lingered in every breeze. The town of Riverside buzzed with the story of a young pup who had led an entire team of people and dogs to safety through an unrecorded trail. All praise, all admiring eyes turned toward one name: Atlas. But when a miracle spills beyond the borders of emotion, it begins to attract another kind of attention, the kind that seeks to analyze, possess, and control. Grace knew it would come. She just hadn't expected it so soon. Around midday, while Atlas was resting after days of exhaustion, a sleek black SUV crept into the clinic's yard. It wasn't the kind of vehicle Riverside locals used. And the 3 people who stepped out, 2 men and 1 woman, impeccably dressed with eyes that gleamed too brightly, were not there to check on their pets. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitaker," the woman began, her voice polite to the point of coldness. "We're from the Institute for Applied Biological Cooperation. We were sent following data analysis collected from yesterday's fire and the phenomena related to your dog." Grace remained calm. "I haven't sent any data to anyone." The man beside her smiled softly, like a breeze. "Public data, social media footage, sensor algorithm readings from the region, all point to a subject, your dog, Atlas, exhibiting anticipatory response patterns outside traditional reflex frameworks." "Subject?" Marcus had just stepped in from the supply shed, his voice suddenly low. "He has a name. And a soul. He's not yours to classify." The younger man pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase and laid it on the table. "We understand the sensitivity here, but we ask that you review our proposal. We can provide Atlas with a high-standard living environment, a top research team, lifetime medical care, and most importantly, a chance to fully develop his potential without the dangers of an uncontrolled civilian setting." "Uncontrolled?" Grace gave a dry chuckle. "You're calling a living creature's life dangerous just because it doesn't unfold in a lab?" The woman nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Grace. "We're not denying he's a special being. That's precisely why he needs guidance. Atlas's abilities, if properly harnessed, could save thousands of lives. They could redefine human understanding of sensory limits." Marcus gripped his backpack straps tightly. "We know exactly what you want. Not to understand him, but to replicate. And to control," Grace said softly. "Then commodify. Then reduce something living into a formula." The youngest of the group took a step back, saying nothing. The woman remained composed. "You're refusing, knowing we can take this to court? You're threatening me?" Grace's voice was calm, unwavering. "Number just stating facts," the man replied. "If Atlas's capabilities go beyond instinct and fall under abnormal neural structures or genetic mutation, the government has legal grounds to intervene in the interest of public welfare." The silence that followed was taut, like a wire stretched to the breaking point. Then Grace stepped toward the back door and gently pushed it open. Atlas was sitting there, watching. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just observed, like he always did. And when his eyes met the woman in the gray suit, she involuntarily paused mid-step. Because in that gaze, there was no confusion, only one thing: awareness. Grace turned back and gently rested her hand on Atlas's head. "He's not a product of experiment. He's not something that needs guiding. He knows who he is and chooses what to do. The woman retrieved the envelope. You're trading the future of an entire field of research for personal sentiment. It's not sentiment, Grace whispered. It's ethics. As the Institute's car disappeared down the dusty road, Marcus leaned against the wall with a sigh. They'll come back. Maybe next time they won't be so polite. I know, Grace said. Then she looked down at Atlas, now sitting right beside her, eyes still fixed on the direction the vehicle had gone. But I also know, she continued slowly, that you weren't born to live in a glass box. You're a miracle the world isn't ready to understand, and shouldn't rush to own. Atlas raised his head and nudged her hand, not asking to be protected, but as if to say, we'll protect our freedom by living it. After the tense confrontation with the private research institute, the atmosphere around the clinic thickened, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet vigilance that settled into every breath. Grace knew she couldn't keep Atlas separate from the world forever, but she also understood that if the doors of science only opened for the sake of control, then miracles like Atlas would never be seen for the pure wonders they truly were. That's why, when the proposal from Dr. Sarah Redmond arrived, not through an organization, not accompanied by silent convoys of black cars, but in the form of a handwritten letter, Grace was genuinely surprised. Sarah was one of the leading experts in the field of integrative animal psychology, a rare discipline that not only examined behavior, but also explored emotional perception and interspecies response. She had famously rejected research programs with exploitative agendas and was known for working only with animals raised in environments that honored absolute freedom. In her letter she wrote, "I'm not coming to measure. I only wish to witness, if you'll allow me. Sometimes the only thing we must learn is how to listen with the humility that science has long forgotten." That afternoon, Sarah arrived in Riverside alone, driving a faded pickup truck, carrying nothing but a worn, leather-bound notebook and an old pair of binoculars. No camera, no laptop, no charts. She was slender, her graying hair tied back, her brown eyes deep like fertile soil long cultivated. When she met Grace, she didn't ask immediately about Atlas. She simply requested to walk around the house, to sit for a few hours in the backyard where Atlas often lay in the afternoons. She observed silently, without note-taking, without intruding on the space. Atlas didn't shy away, but neither did he approach. He simply watched her back, his bright eyes steady and silent, as if assessing the quiet woman before him in his own way. And then, as the sunset began to spill across the rooftop edges, Mia arrived. She came with her father, as she did every week, still holding the fabric-worn stuffed rabbit, but her expression had changed. No longer a vague emptiness adrift in a broken soul, but a gaze that searched, that waited. When she saw Atlas, Mia offered a gentle smile, then sat beside him as usual, without command, without invitation. Atlas leaned in, nestling his head into her lap. Sarah Redmond paused halfway down the wooden steps, her hand resting on her chest, where her heart had just skipped a beat. Because in that dim golden light, she wasn't just seeing a little girl and a dog. She saw something primal, something that transcended the relationship of owner and pet. Mia was not commanding. Atlas was not obeying. They simply met, in an unseen place both had once lost in their lives. Minutes later, something even more astonishing happened. Mia, still shy and selective in her words, turned to Sarah, her wide eyes soft, her voice small but clear. "She's sad, but she doesn't say it." Sarah froze. "You're thinking about the gray cat," Mia continued, her tiny fingers unconsciously stroking Atlas's ear. "The one you lost. You miss her." Sarah's hand trembled slightly. No one, not even Grace, knew that before coming to Riverside, she had just buried her old cat who had lived with her for 17 years. The cat had passed on the sofa, her head resting on Sarah's lap, while she was rereading her earliest papers on emotional bonding in animals. "How did you know that?" she whispered. Mia smiled. the kind of smile a child gives when explanations are unnecessary. Atlas knew, and he told me. That evening, in a living room filled with the scent of herbal tea, Sarah Redmond placed her notebook on the table, her eyes distant, as if returning from a long journey within herself. "Grace," she said softly, "I came here as a scientist, but I'm leaving as someone relearning how to listen." Grace said nothing, just gently stroked Atlas's back. He lay curled between the two women, eyes half closed but ears still attentive. "There's something in him that doesn't need explanation," Sarah continued. "No labels, no measurements. He doesn't break the rules of biology. He reminds us that some rhythms of connection have existed for far longer. We've just forgotten how to feel them." Grace looked up. "So, what will you write in your research?" Sarah smiled, light as steam from a teacup. "Just one line. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing about a being is the peace it brings when you touch your soul through it." After that quietly seismic afternoon, when Dr. Sarah Redmond left Riverside with a faint smile and her notebook closed like a silent ritual, Grace believed the strange occurrences had reached their limits. But with Atlas, there was always another depth. A wave not yet touched. A door not yet dared open. That night, the air was still. The moon hung low, and silver light blurred across the living room window panes. Grace sat on the long couch, her hand resting lightly on the pages of an unfinished book. Atlas lay close by her feet, as always, but his eyes weren't surrendering to sleep. He was awake, not with his eyes, but with a kind of awareness that was deep, slow, and turned inward. Grace sighed, a soft exhale without clear reason, when Atlas rose. Not abruptly, not unnaturally. He simply moved closer, very close, and gently placed one front paw on her knee. No pressure, no weight, just a quiet touch between two worlds. And then, everything changed. Grace didn't see anything with her eyes, but she felt a layer of sensation she had never known before. As if beneath the everyday world of sight and sound, there was another realm in motion. Currents of air, subtle tremors in space, the quiet breath of leaves, the trickling of underground springs, and heartbeats forgotten in unlit homes. She didn't know what to call it, but it wasn't a hallucination. It was pure intuition, untainted by consciousness, unfiltered by reason. She felt a current of energy flowing from his paw into her skin, then deeper, through each capillary, into her chest, rising to her throat with a sense of complete understanding so profound that her tears came. Not from pain, but from release. Atlas looked directly into her eyes, not asking, not speaking, but guiding, as though he was leading her through a wordless labyrinth. In that moment, Grace knew, in the truest sense of the word, that Atlas had felt her pain long before she had ever named it. He had sensed each suffocating memory that pressed upon her when she woke cold and disoriented in the military barracks, every shattered fragment of the comrades she had lost, and the final glance from the K-9 partner who died beside her in their last mission in Afghanistan. Atlas hadn't just listened. He had carried that pain within himself, not to bear it for her, but to share it. And at that very moment, Grace understood why he didn't need to speak, why he didn't need training, testing, or measurement, because he didn't understand humans in the way humans liked to define. He felt, with a presence so whole it could dissolve the walls built within the human soul. Dr. Redmond, who had returned to say her goodbye, stepped into the room just as that profound silence settled into the space. She paused at the doorway, seeing Grace unmoving, her eyes brimming with tears, her hand still resting on Atlas's paw. And in those eyes, Sarah saw someone who had just crossed a threshold beyond ordinary experience. "You felt it too," she whispered, not expecting a reply. Grace nodded slightly, saying nothing. Atlas stood and gave a small shake, as if the transmission hadn't exhausted him, but required a quiet reset after an exchange deeper than language. Dr. Redmond slowly stepped forward, sitting beside them. "He's not just a bridge between emotions," she said softly. "He's the gatekeeper to a kind of perception creatures too dependent on logic, abandoned long ago." "And the strangest part," Grace replied, her voice almost breaking, "is that he never asks for anything in return when he gives it." Outside, the night wind rustled through the trees, the sound of leaves whispering like echoes of an ancient world, a world where humans once understood animals not through commands, but through pure intuition. In that old wooden house, under the moonlight, a woman, a scientist, and a dog sat together. 3 distinct beings, yet at that moment touching a depth of existence that some may spend their entire lives never knowing even once. The next morning, the air still hadn't shaken off the lingering stillness from the night before, when a single, gentle touch from Atlas had opened a doorway into a world of unnamed intuition. Grace could still feel something stirring in her chest, like the echo of a breath larger than words, larger than understanding, a current of perception flowing quietly in her blood, making her begin to see things she had once overlooked with a heart too tired to notice. But Atlas never stopped at emotion. For him, connection had never been an endpoint. It was always a beginning of action. He skipped breakfast for the 3rd time that month. Marcus had learned to read the signs. It wasn't an illness. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fussiness. Atlas was listening to something beyond human reach, but ringing loud and clear within him, like a low note, humming from a place unnamed. He walked to the door, didn't look back, didn't need to gesture. But when Marcus met his eyes, he knew. This time, they had to go now. Grace was bottle-feeding a kitten when Marcus simply said, "I think there's something we're meant to see." They got in the car. No destination. Atlas sat in the back, silent but tense, his eyes fixed out the window like he was tracing unseen currents in the air. He breathed lightly, evenly, but his body wasn't slack. It was taut, as if ready to leap beyond the physical world the moment his instinct locked onto the right direction. It wasn't until they turned down a patch of wasteland at the edge of town, an old lumber yard long abandoned for nearly a decade, that Atlas sprang up. He whined softly, then tapped the window with his paw. A familiar signal. Grace hit the brakes. They stepped out into a sea of knee-high weeds, a warehouse buried under a thick layer of dust that made the air feel haunted. No footprints, no sounds, no lights. Only a strange, dense silence covered the place like someone had tried to erase it from all senses. Atlas didn't hesitate. He ran straight to the rusted metal door, didn't bark, didn't pause. Every step was a decision. At the threshold he whimpered, louder this time, then scratched gently at the crumbling wall. Marcus moved in and pried the door open with a crowbar. The hinges screeched, slicing the air. And inside, there was a litter of puppies. 7 in total. Tiny bodies curled up together, brittle and dry from exhaustion, too weak to cry. The light flooded in, making a few lift their heads in reflex, their eyes cloudy, unfocused, as if they'd spent so long in the dark, they'd forgotten how to look toward the light. One smallest pup tried to crawl toward the doorway but collapsed halfway there. Grace's breath caught, and her heart clenched tight. "They've been here at least 5 days," Marcus whispered, kneeling to place a hand on the tiniest chest. "Heartbeats faint, but there. No mother, no food, no water." Grace's voice cracked. "They were left like garbage." Atlas didn't enter the room. He just stood watch, like a silent guardian. His eyes never left the puppies, but his gaze held no panic, no rage, only recognition, and perhaps a promise. Grace and Marcus lifted each one carefully into a box lined with towels, bundled in jackets and thermal packs. They brought them to the veterinary clinic. That entire night the light stayed on. Incubators buzzed. Warm milk was delivered by syringe, milliliter by milliliter. IV fluids dripped slowly. The first 3 pulled through the crisis. 2 weaker ones still had swallowing reflexes. The final two, barely responsive. But no one gave up. Atlas stood guard all night outside the incubator room, his eyes never closing. He breathed softly, head tilted slightly toward the little ones. And when the smallest finally twitched her ears and let out a faint cry like she was calling for her mother, it was Atlas who rose first, walked silently to the incubator, and laid his head beside it as if to say, "It's all right now. I heard you." A week later, when all 7 had passed the danger zone, the local newspaper ran a long feature. The Silent Dog and the Forgotten Litter, a miracle in a rotten warehouse. But to Grace and Marcus, it wasn't just a miracle, it was a reminder that wherever forgotten lives tremble in the dark, Atlas will feel it. That miracles are not just for marveling, they are a call to action. That same day, they officially launched the campaign, Here to Save, a community initiative against animal neglect, starting with volunteer patrols, anonymous reporting systems, and educational sessions teaching children compassion toward the voiceless. And the one who inspired it all didn't need a microphone, a spotlight, or thunderous applause. He was simply a quiet dog, with ears always open to the sounds humans had grown used to ignoring. The trembling of life left behind, the cry for help that had no words. His name was Atlas, and what he offered was a gentle but resolute reminder. Silence does not mean absence, and those who can hear the silence carry within them the power to heal. Following the community-wide campaign that swept through Riverside, sparked by the quiet dog who had led Grace and Marcus to a forgotten litter of puppies, Atlas became more than just a symbol of compassion. He became a catalyst for questions no one had dared ask before. Could emotion, intuition, and awareness in animals reach a level of resonance that defied language? Could a dog not only understand humans, but touch the unspoken thoughts before they took form? It was those very questions that led Dr. Sarah Redmond, after weeks of careful discussion, to propose a special kind of experiment, one with no agenda to control or extract, but simply an invitation for Atlas to step into a scientific space as an equal, not to prove anything, but simply to be. At first, Grace fell silent when Sarah spoke about conscious resonance, a term rarely used in traditional studies because it couldn't be measured by electrodes or neural charts. But when Sarah placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder and spoke with a voice weighted by meaning, not to prove something, but so that humans may relearn how to trust the thing we've lost, our original intuition between living beings, Grace understood. This time no one had come to take Atlas away. They had come to sit beside him, to be silent, to listen, the way he always listened to others. The experiment took place in a small research room, not a sterile white lab with one-way mirrors and fluorescent lights, but a space designed like a living room. Wooden chairs, a warm wool rug, white curtains fluttering with the breeze, and a few green plants near the window. Sarah believed that authenticity could not grow in artificial space. Atlas was allowed complete freedom, no leash, no equipment restraints. The participants, Sarah, an emotional therapist, and 2 animal behavior psychologists, would take turns thinking about a specific action, like walking out the door, making a phone call, or opening a drawer, without facial expression, movement, or sound. Most importantly, there were no cues, no bait, no subconscious prompts. The experiment began. The first was Dr. Elena, the therapist, sitting with arms crossed, face neutral. In her mind, she imagined stepping out of the room to make a call. No one knew what she was thinking. But seconds later, Atlas, lying by the window, rose and calmly walked to the door, turned to face her. Didn't bark, didn't wag, just waited, as if ready to go with her. The second was John, the animal psychologist, seated in the opposite corner, picturing himself retrieving a green pencil from the bottom drawer. Atlas didn't move right away. He lifted his head, ears alert, then quietly approached, not to John, but to the drawer's edge, and gently nudged the precise spot with his nose. The third was Sarah, whom Atlas already knew. She closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she imagined only one thing: sitting beside Atlas and placing a hand softly on his head as a silent thank you. No movement, no signal. Atlas didn't stir for 3 seconds. Then slowly he walked over to her, not with head high but low, then gently placed his forehead against her upturned hand, resting on her knee. No one had told him to do it. He just knew. No one sighed. No one applauded. But the entire room fell into a hush, like something deep and immeasurable had just passed through them, halting even time itself. After the session, no one offered praise, no celebration, just Sarah's eyes, slightly red as she leaned down to meet Atlas's gaze and whispered, "We thought we needed more tools to connect with the world, but maybe what we need is less noise in our minds. He doesn't read thoughts. He reads the density of emotion. And what humbles me most is that he chooses to respond with peace." Grace remained beside her, silent. In the soft light of the late afternoon, Atlas returned to his place on the rug, resting his head gently on his front paws, eyes half closed as if nothing unusual had just occurred. But everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something beyond skill or training. They had brushed up against a kind of pre-verbal language, a place where beings once knew how to understand each other through stillness. And he, the dog named Atlas, had not spoken a word. But through his quiet gaze and steady presence, it was as if he had been whispering all along. To truly feel each other, we must first be willing to be still. Even as the echoes of the consciousness resonance experiment had yet to fully fade, while researchers were still quietly poring over notes, analyzing moments, and silently marveling at the unspoken connection Atlas had demonstrated, it was he, in the most familiar and unassuming way, who once again disrupted every framework humans had ever built around animal cognition. That morning, the weather was clear and calm, sunlight spreading gently over the patch of land behind the rescue center, where Grace and Marcus were training a group of newly rescued urban search dogs. Atlas, though not officially part of the group, was there as always, not to learn, but to listen. He often stood at the edges, watching each dog's movements, occasionally stepping into a session if he sensed a pup growing anxious or distracted. He didn't intervene, just stood close. His presence alone seemed to calm the space and slow down someone's racing heart. But today, just as Marcus was guiding a scent tracking drill and Grace was adjusting a harness on a dog named Bruno, Atlas suddenly stood bolt upright. No strange sound, no scent of fire, no obvious signal that humans could detect. He let out a low whimper, then turned toward the old wooden fence leading to the nearby neighborhood. His eyes locked on a pale green house at the end of a small lane, where no smoke rose from the chimney and the windows remained shut. "Atlas!" Grace called, but he didn't stop. He ran, not wildly, but with urgency, as if each step were racing something only he could perceive. Grace rushed across the training field, calling Marcus while pulling out her phone to notify the homeowner. But Atlas had already reached the house. He barked, not in a general alert, but in a sharp, rapid pattern, like an urgent knocking. The front gate was closed, and no one answered. Grace arrived just as Atlas let out a sharp growl and clawed at the edge of the garage door with both front paws. He wasn't trying to break in. He just stood there, eyes locked on one point, on the right-hand wall where the main electrical box was embedded. Guided by instinct, Grace pressed her ear to the wooden wall and heard it. A dry, faint crackling, steady and low. She called for Marcus. Within 3 minutes, they had peeled back the outer plywood panel and discovered a tangled mess of wires, chewed by rodents, with one faulty circuit breaker failing to shut off a dangerously rising current. "Another few minutes," Marcus said, his face pale, "and it would have ignited from the insulation." The house sat tightly between two others, their walls nearly touching, all built with highly flammable materials. Had Atlas not sensed it? Had he not acted in time? A single spark during breakfast hours could have turned the entire row into a blazing tragedy. No one would have known what had started it. The only sign had been a sound too faint for any human to hear. The homeowner, a retired woman away visiting her daughter out of state, had left no one behind. There were no smoke alarms triggered. If Atlas hadn't felt it and reacted in time, that peaceful morning would have ended as a headline soaked in sorrow. "He hears electricity getting angry," Marcus half joked, though his eyes were deadly serious. "He doesn't hear," Grace replied softly, still watching Atlas, now seated calmly on the porch, ears alert but not tense. "He feels what we've never been taught to hear." That afternoon, after the entire system had been replaced and the tension subsided, Marcus leaned against the railing, staring down the quiet street, his voice lower than usual. If a dog can sense disaster before it happens, then the question isn't, how did he know? But, do we have the courage to believe him, even when nothing's happened yet? Grace didn't answer. She simply sat beside Atlas, gently running her hand along his back, still radiating that quiet energy only those who had stood close to life and death could feel. And there, in the fading gold of afternoon light, a dog who knew nothing of titles or rewards simply did what he felt was right, as if he were born to guard this world against things not yet formed. Right after the near fire, Atlas had warned them off, a disaster that never became real because someone seemed to have read time before it turned. The town of Riverside entered a state of quiet awe and subtle unease. Local papers called Atlas the silent hero. Schools used him as a living lesson in courage. Families pinned his photo to bulletin boards, calling him a symbol of goodness that needed no proclamation. And yet, as with every miracle humanity has ever encountered, admiration was soon followed by fear, of ownership, of legality, of questions that seemed protective on the surface, but masked the urge to control. And so, an emergency town council meeting was convened. Not just with officials, but residents, experts, and even people from beyond Riverside who had taken a keen interest in Atlas as his story spread across social media. Grace received an invitation to attend as the current caretaker of an entity of exceptional communal, cognitive, and public safety value. The wording was careful, polite, but to her it rang like a cold legal definition waiting to be applied. That evening, the council chamber was packed. Every seat along the walls was filled. Ceiling fans turned slowly. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on faces tensed between curiosity and concern. At the front row, council members flipped through folders, occasionally glancing towards the center, where Grace sat beside Atlas, her hand resting lightly on his back as if to quietly declare, "I am here for him. Nothing else." The council president rose, voice calm, opening with genuine praise for Atlas's role in elevating community awareness, emergency intervention, and fostering unity. Then he cleared his throat and shifted tone, toward the matter at hand, where the picture of benevolence blurred with questions of control. "Given Atlas's increasing role in public life," he said, "there has been a proposal to formally recognize him as a protected community asset, a living symbol subject to legal designation to prevent exploitation or unauthorized relocation." The room stirred with whispers. Grace stood slowly. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, but when she spoke, the entire room fell silent. Atlas is not a possession. He is not a symbol. And he is certainly not something anyone, including me, can represent or claim. He is a living being, a consciousness, a soul who has chosen to walk with us, not because he was forced, but because he wanted to give. And I ask you all, if a being dares to feel on our behalf, dares to save when we are still hesitating, then is our first response really to decide what laws we should bind him with? The silence deepened. She stepped forward, into the circle of overhead light, and continued, her voice lower now, as though speaking to the part of every person that had once believed in freedom before fear crept in. What makes Atlas extraordinary is not his ability to predict danger, not how many lives he has saved, but the fact that he does all of it without asking for anything in return, No reward, no title. He is freedom in the form of devotion. One council member spoke, hesitantly. But what if someday an organization shows up and tries to take him? Says they have the legal right because there's no law protecting him. We don't need laws to protect what's right, Grace replied. We need hearts. She turned to Atlas, still sitting calmly, eyes not anxious but serene, as if he already knew, as if he had always known, and was simply waiting quietly for her to choose trust over fear. By the end of the meeting, after long debates, the council made a decision. They would not attach any legal designation to Atlas. Instead, they passed a resolution with no precedent to recognize Atlas as a free being of the community, not owned, not regulated, not exploited, simply respected and accompanied. It was the first time in the town's history that a dog, without speaking a word, had been listened to as an equal presence. And for Grace, it wasn't a victory. It was a moment where humanity chose to relinquish power to preserve what is pure. After the town hall meeting in which Atlas was officially recognized not as a possession, nor something to be owned or governed, but as a free living soul, the air in Riverside softened in a quiet yet unmistakable way. Those who once doubted him now bowed gently when they passed him at the corner of Main Street. Children, on their way to school each morning, would detour past the clinic just to catch a glimpse of him dozing peacefully under the wooden awning. The elderly men sipping coffee downtown often started their conversations with, "I saw Atlas looking toward the hills yesterday. Something might be coming." His name no longer echoed as some distant miracle, but had become something familiar, like the Sunday church bells at noon, or the scent of corn muffins drifting through kitchen windows each autumn morning. And then, one late autumn day, as the maple leaves turned a soft blaze of orange and gold, and the mountain ridges to the west wrapped themselves in the morning mist, a letter arrived at Grace's clinic. It bore the official seal of the governor of Colorado. Formal language, bold black ink, heavy paper still fragrant with freshness. But what made Grace pause was the final line. "We would like to honor Atlas as a living symbol of courage, healing intuition, and the sacred bond between humans and animals." The award ceremony was held one quiet afternoon on the grass behind the town hall. There were no grand banners, no exaggerated production, just a humble wooden stage, a few rows of folding chairs, and the presence of those whose lives had been touched by Atlas. Little Mia, now able to speak in full, clear sentences and walk unaided beside her father. The man rescued from a mountain landslide, arriving with a cane and eyes heavy with gratitude. The elderly woman whose home had nearly burned down, trembling as she placed a small bouquet at Atlas's feet on the stage. Grace didn't give a long speech. She simply spoke of the moment Atlas first touched her, not with paw or muzzle, but with something deeper and quieter. And from that moment, her life had changed entirely. The governor leaned down to place the medal around Atlas's neck. A simple silver medallion, engraved with a single star and just one line beneath it. "He hears what no one dares to hear." After the ceremony, amid countless offers of partnerships, sponsorships, and research proposals, Grace chose none. Instead, she and Marcus, her fellow veteran, who had known both the brutality of war and the fragile hope restored by a four-legged soul, quietly began a new chapter. They opened a therapeutic center for veterans, autistic children, and those carrying unseen emotional wounds. They called it Haven Point, not a place to fix everything, but a space where pain was allowed to exist, where people weren't rushed to be okay again, but invited to step into silence, into the tender presence of non-judgmental eyes and a gentle touch. Atlas became the soul of the center. He didn't train the other dogs, nor did he act as a role model. He simply existed, as he always had, by Mia's side, by Grace's side, beside any soul needing a shared breath. The other dogs, mostly rescues, slowly learned from him not through commands but through resonance. He would walk into a room and lie quietly beside someone unraveling from a panic attack. He wouldn't bark or nuzzle. He would just be there until their breathing steadied and clenched fingers softened, finally resting on his warm fur like an apology to their own hurting hearts. And from that moment forward, healing didn't begin with therapy. It began with trust, reclaimed in a wordless touch. By the end of that winter, a small wooden sign was placed outside Haven Point, not with LED lights, not with gold lettering, just one simple line etched deeply into the grain. Here, no one is asked to be strong, only to be present. We and our four-legged friends will listen to the rest. And just below it, carved faintly as a whisper not meant to be loud, written by Grace, Marcus, and Atlas. When spring quietly touched the eaves of Haven Point, a place that had become a refuge for souls once held captive by darkness, Grace, on a soft morning breeze, felt something stir inside her, not from incompletion, but from arrival. Something still waited, not left behind, but calling to be returned to. And as naturally as breath itself, Atlas rose beside her, gaze fixed towards the west, where the old riverside bridge still stretched across the Colorado River, fierce and gentle, like a silent mother watching over her children. No invitation was sent. No leash was needed. But in his eyes, Grace understood. It was time to go back. Not to recover something lost, but to face it, as who they had now become, carrying the light they had kindled together. The bridge, after a year, had been reinforced and freshly painted, but its railings remained the same, the ones the wind once howled through on that May afternoon. Nothing around had changed much. Yet within Grace, every step rethreaded old memories, of a leash slipping through her fingers, a cry of desperation, and that final, fleeting touch of soft fur before a small body vanished like a fallen leaf. Atlas walked ahead, unhurried. He stopped at the bridge's midpoint, where the winds still shifted, and stood, ears perked, staring into the water below. Grace joined him, her breath carrying the weight of a year lived, loved, and slowly healed through the quiet presence of this being. Then Atlas turned to her, gently. No ritual, no grandeur. He lifted one paw and placed it on her chest, the same gesture he had made that night in the quiet living room when the first door to his world had opened. But this time, it didn't feel like witnessing someone else's pain. This time, it felt like a union of two souls, two timelines, two heartbeats. Grace saw nothing with her eyes, but she felt everything, as if a wordless melody had risen in her chest. The river didn't just flow, it sang. The breeze didn't just move, it whispered. The rustling woods in the distance weren't just ambient noise, they were stories, tales of small, unnoticed lives moving together in sacred rhythm. She felt not just a connection between human and dog, but between every speck of dust in the air and her own heart cracking open. Atlas stood still, but his eyes were no longer those of a 3-month-old pup who once slipped through those rails. They were the eyes of a soul that had traveled across time, carrying a language that could only be named with one word. Knowing. Together, they looked down at the river, the place where he had once fallen, where the first miracle had quietly taken root in the stuttering heartbeat of a woman who had nearly lost her will to hope, where a small, silent being chose not just to survive, but to become a flame in the dark for hearts that no longer believed in light. In the golden haze of dusk, the water shimmered amber, not violent, not still, but murmuring secrets we had forgotten how to hear. Grace placed her hand on Atlas's back. No words were needed. Every syllable would have been an interruption, and in that moment, she understood. They hadn't met by accident. They had been meant, from a place beyond reason, beyond fate, where loyalty was no longer instinct, but a form of love freely chosen. The story of Atlas will be told. There will be books, studies, films, But for Grace, and for anyone who had truly looked into his eyes, nothing more needed to be said. Because everything worth knowing had already been written. In the gaze, on that bridge, on the final evening of a journey that never truly ends. The story of Atlas is not merely a tale of miraculous survival after an impossible fall. It is a testament to a form of connection that defies every box we've ever tried to place it in. A bond where a dog listens to what humans don't say, senses pain before it surfaces, and heals not with words, but with presence. Perhaps in every life, there is an Atlas, a silent being who walks in at the exact moment we are most lost. And what about you? Have you ever met a dog? Or lived through a moment that made you believe in a bond beyond language? We would love to hear your story in the comments below. If Atlas's journey moved you, don't forget to like, share this video with someone who might need a bit of light today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of deep, healing love between humans and our four-legged friends. See you in the next story.